This is the quote shown to you immediately upon beginning Blasphemous. The Blasphemous games have quickly become one of my favorite duos in the gaming industry, and by that I just mean a video game series with only 2 games in them. However, I wasn't even a fan of Blasphemous during my first go around, so before we get into what you came for this video, I'm just gonna recap my short history with these 2 games, and how I grew to love both of them. Of course, if you just want to skip to the ranking, I'll have a timestamp for that on screen, and let's get into it. I was blinded by ignorance in my first playthrough of Blasphemous, blaming my confusion on the game itself despite not attempting to fully grasp the game's mechanics, which resulted in it just being a forgettable experience to me. So again, after I completed the first ending of Blasphemous, I was simply done with this game. I didn't like how there were no movement upgrades, I didn't understand the history and culture that the game was based on, and I just thought that the game dragged. Months would go by without my opinion on it changing, but then I gave the sequel a chance. Blasphemous 2 was this series' chance to reel me back in, and it absolutely did, because the mechanics were more what I was used to from other Metroidvania games, and also, I finally started to be more knowledgeable about the culture it's based on. After I completed Blasphemous 2, I loved it, and because of that, I went back to the first game and loved it as well. Now, if you want a more detailed reasoning for why I was wrong about Blasphemous during my first playthrough, I made a video on that topic already, so now that my history with the game is out of the way, let's discuss actually comparing these 2 games and seeing which one is truly the better video game overall. This is Blasphemous versus Blasphemous 2. We're gonna start with the presentation, which kinda just means we're gonna talk about the graphics, the art style, the performance, stuff like that. Besides the performance, which is a complete non-issue in these games, I mean, neither of these games ever lag even a single time. The rest of these issues are pretty subjective, so bear with me here. I usually like to be objective about these kinds of comparisons, so let's get one of the subjective topics out of the way to start it off. First off, art style. Blasphemous goes for a pixelated look, yet it's still quite detailed. It's retro themed, sure, but you're definitely gonna see some complicated designs, unlike a game like Shovel Knight, which is based on the Nintendo Entertainment System, so it's very oversimplified. Now, the Blasphemous games are set in Spain and are very much based on Spanish and Roman Catholic culture. I am neither of those things, but can still recognize how beautiful the culture is that they're showing off. I also think that the art style works really well with the game's heavy usage of blood, since it's still detailed enough for you to get grossed out, but not realistic enough to make you want to throw up. So how does the sequel, Blasphemous 2, expand on the style of the first game? Well, while it definitely is quite divisive in comparison, I really like it. Starting with the general difference in art style, and again, I do quite like the change. It's the same general art style, but there's a lot more smoothing going on. The original game is definitely more clear that it's pixelated, and as much as I like the graphics from the first game, the general art style of Blasphemous 2 is actually my preference. However, one change that people really didn't enjoy was the cutscenes becoming fully animated, rather than remaining in the same general pixelated art style like they are in the first game. I can definitely see the complaint here. Sure, the animation is great, but it was just more immersive and better for the flow of the game, at least in my opinion, for the animation to correspond with the rest of the game's graphics. Again, this is definitely looking a bit deep into it. I mean, it really doesn't matter at all, but I'm gonna give this comparison a tie because while I prefer how Blasphemous 2 looks as a game, the original game retains a consistent, unique art style, and I think that's just as valuable. So let's give both games a point and move on to the next comparison. Next, we're going to be discussing the general combat mechanics in these 2 games. Beginning with the first game, Blasphemous is a Metroidvania game with Dark Souls-inspired combat. In fact, a lot of players have described Blasphemous as it's Dark Souls if it was a Metroidvania. You'll be able to do things like sliding, parrying, typical Souls-like slop. Although this was in 2019, so before 2D Souls-likes became incredibly oversaturated. Your general attack method is obviously your sword, which is called Mea Culpa. Throughout your journey, you'll unlock these upgrade shrines, and this is obviously where you'll unlock new tiers and have access to a variety of upgrades to purchase for your weapon. The progression with this is very rewarding, giving you access to useful new moves such as a charge attack, a strike from above, and my personal favorite, the lunge attack, and that's pretty much it for for the main weapon, but you can also use prayers. Prayers are the magic weapon in Blasphemous, and there are a ton of different ones to choose from. You can only equip one at a time though, so make sure to use one that fits the way you approach combat. It's also a good idea to pick one that aligns well with the rosary beads you're using. What are rosary beads, you may ask? Well, since most of you guys in my audience have played a lot of Metroidvanias, it's the same thing as charms from Hollow Knight or shards from Ori and the Will of the Wisps. You have a few different slots to attach these to, and they basically just improve specific areas in combat. There's also one more upgrade that you can apply in Blasphemous, and that's sword hearts. All you do for this is pick a specific one that fits your style and insert it into the mea culpa to apply the upgrade. So that's basically all there is to the combat in Blasphemous. It's not very complicated compared to other games, but it was just complicated enough for it to confuse me on my first playthrough, but I'm gonna stop talking about my first playthrough constantly. So overall, I think the combat in Blasphemous is really great. Sure, it might not be as fast-paced as other Metroidvanias, and sure, it may be a turnoff that the game doesn't really have any true movement upgrades. There are some environmental upgrades you can get, but that just opens new pathways around the map. It only helps with exploration, but I still think it's awesome once you really get the hang of it. So what does Blasphemous 2 do with the combat? Well, it makes a lot of changes. Prayers and rosary beads remain pretty much the same, although prayers are now split into two categories, meaning you can now equip two at a time, but sword hearts are now gone because so is the mea culpa. When you begin Blasphemous 2, you get to choose between 3 weapons to start your playthrough: a traditional sword weapon, 2 faster dagger-like weapons, or a heavier mace-like weapon. I do not feel like doing research into what specifically these weapons all are, nor do I feel like trying to pronounce their names, but you can definitely see how this spices up combat quite a bit. Not only could the flow of each playthrough be much different, but as you progress through the game and obtain all 3 weapons at once, you can swap between them at any time, meaning there are a ton of great options for making specific combat builds in this game. Also, I have not even mentioned the movement upgrades this game introduces, making the game's combat inherently much faster paced. This allows for the level design of Blasphemous to not just rely on having fun enemies to battle, but also helps it to achieve more satisfying platforming sections where you'll be expected to dash and double jump your way to the end. The first game did have some good platforming sections, and especially with the bloodstained crossover stages, but even those can feel a bit clunky in comparison to just how many improvements the movement upgrades add to the gameplay. So because of those reasons, I have to give the combat to Blasphemous 2. Yes, Blasphemous 1 still has great combat, but Blasphemous 2 refines it in ways that make you never want to go back, giving the sequel the 2-to-1 lead in the ranking thus far. Next is going to be a very interesting comparison, and that's the boss fights. Which game has the better bosses? The truth is, both games have a ton of great bosses. Now, since this isn't a dedicated boss ranking or anything, I'm not going to go in detail about my opinion on each and every boss fight. So to substitute, I made this chart giving a letter grade to each boss from both games, and as you can see, it's a very close comparison, but the general results were that the bosses in the second game were a tiny bit better on average. However, there are technically more bosses in total in the original game, but keep in mind, there are a few duplicate or very similar boss fights. But yeah, generally speaking, first game has quantity and second has quality, and even though it's not by much, you have to go with Blasphemous 2 here. There's also the possibility that you don't agree with the reviews I gave each boss, and that's entirely fine, but man, did I really enjoy most of the boss fights in the second game. They're generally faster paced and have a lot more unique attack patterns compared to the first game, which kind of just reflects how much better the combat is in the sequel. There are great boss fights in the first game like Serpes and Chrysanta, which might be the best boss in the series, but Blasphemous 2 consistently gives you 8.5 out of 10 fights over and over and over. Interestingly enough, I've heard from some people that when Blasphemous 2 first released, the game had several balancing issues, and especially with the bosses being a little bit too easy. I came across this video from a guy named Pogo Bro, and basically in his video he says the game was way easier than it should have been, and like I said, especially with the boss fights. Now this video was published 7 days after the game released, and if you look in the comment section, you'll see a ton of people pointing out that the game has been patched to be a lot more balanced in terms of difficulty, which as As somebody who played the game about a year after it released, I didn't think the game was insanely hard or anything, but it wasn't easy either. So just in case any of you played this game at launch and disagree with me that the bosses are any good at all, it's very likely I had a much different experience than you did. Anyway, I really like the boss fights in the second game, so let's give it the 3-1 lead in the ranking. Let's move on to talking about the music. Again, both games have awesome soundtracks, but I think I'm once again going to side with the second game. But first, let's compare it. The first Blasphemous game offers very solid and predictable Spanish music. It's great throughout the game, but it's not something that's going to change the way you view music or anything. At least that's what I would have said if you asked me a few months ago. Nowadays, I cannot get enough of Carlos Viola's composing. My favorite track in the game is Beso de Plata Redux, which is the theme for the final stage of the Crescenta boss fight. And it's super emotional and one of the most unique compositions in the game. The game also has great atmospheric tracks though. When doing research for this video, I was reminded by just how beautiful that atmospheric music is, and especially that snowy cliff area, man, like wow. I'd argue that atmospheric music is where the first game shines best in the soundtrack department, so while the first game does have a great soundtrack, Carlos Viola simply takes it a step further with the second game. More instruments, more emotion, more variety. Even though I like music from both games, I wholeheartedly believe that Carlos Viola improved as a composer when composing for Blasphemous II. Every track is so much more fitting for where they take place in. Some of the music in the original, while great, could have been mixed around a bit and would still feel completely natural, whereas in the second game, each composition feels completely catered to the area it's placed in, and I think a big reason for that is, again, the second game just has a lot more interesting variety in its instruments. I know that music is unanimously considered to be a subjective thing, so you don't have to agree with me, but honestly, the second Blasphemous just has better music, giving it a commanding 4-1 lead so far in the ranking. Moving on to the narrative, which is going to cover just my opinion on the story in these games, and the underlying narrative that they're presenting to the player. The Blasphemous games have some of the most vague storytelling out of any game series I have ever played. So to prepare for this video, I watched two fantastic videos by a creator called Gingy, titled A Story Analysis of Blasphemous. The videos go over the important characters throughout both of these games, as well as some of the mysteries and oddities about this game's story and narrative. First of all, like I said, the Blasphemous games are extremely vague, so instead of calling it a story, I'd actually be more inclined to just use the word lore. To me, a story is something that is presented directly to you and designed to be easily digestible, but the Blasphemous games do not really do that. They encourage you to do deep dives into the lore of this world, which is something that games have been doing a lot as of late, and I think it's a very great change for game design in general. I myself am not really a lore person, which is why I had to watch Gingy's videos to even get a surface level understanding of what is even going on in these games. So to begin, the Blasphemous games take place in a fictional land in Spain known as Custodia, and the characters and world are designed around a sort of reimagined version of the Catholic religion. There's a lot of references. Like I said, I'm not a Catholic, I'm a Protestant, so I just don't know too much about the source material, but the general idea in these games is that the god of this world is known as the Miracle. The Miracle is never really explained to the player in any particular or easy to understand way. It's always extremely complicated, and this god affects every single character in a different way, sometimes negative, sometimes positive, which leads you to ponder about what intention the Miracle even has. Is it a graceful god or a resentful one? It's something you will be debating constantly. However, out of these two games, I really prefer the narrative in Blasphemous 1 because it's all about showing you just how horrible sinful activities are, especially that quote that I showed you in the beginning of the video. It is not not the sun rising, but our sins. Basically, what this quote means to me is that every time a new day begins, we commit more sins. So instead of looking at the sun coming up, look at it as basically another day, another sin. For me, this quote appearing at the beginning of the game really set the tone for what kind of message the game was pushing to me at the end of the day. The second game naturally would push a similar message, but I enjoy how direct the first game was about it, especially since a lot of characters in this game, their problems were caused by their own will because they wanted to be punished, because they just had so much guilt, and the penitent one acts as a Jesus figure by carrying the guilt for them. In the second game, a lot of the NPCs are suffering, like really badly, but it wasn't really clear to me if it was by their own will that they were punished, which to me just makes it a bit more confusing rather than being impactful and applicable to myself. One last thing that I want to talk about for why I prefer the story of the first Blasphemous is that I think the second game treats Chrysanta, one of the most loved characters from Blasphemous, a bit disrespectfully. Spoilers ahead if you don't want to know about the plot. Basically, she dies in the opening cutscene of the game trying to defeat the person who eventually ends up being, well, let's be honest, pretty much the final boss of the game. And I personally think this could have played out better if they were to hold off Chrysanta's death until you're actually at that point in the game. That way, it's a bit more respectful to the character, and it's still fresh in your mind as you're fighting the boss. So yeah, I apologize that I'm not an expert on the story or lore of these games, but I decided to rank it based on what the games meant to me. Once again, I encourage you guys to check out Gingy's videos if you want a more practical analysis on the Blasphemous lore. So with that out of the way, the score is now 4-2 in favor of the second game. The final main comparison that I have for this list is the content, and what I mean by this is which game has more quality content. If one game has way more content without necessarily sacrificing the quality of the content itself, that would make me choose that game for this comparison. And also, another thing I'll be considering is the pricing, and I think for this I'm gonna end up going with the first game. First of all, if you take a look at How Long to Beat, which is a website for researching how many hours a game will take you to complete, you'll see that both Blasphemous games have very similar amounts of content. The second game takes 2 hours longer to complete on average, but it does not have as much side content as the original. Now, there's a decent reason for this, that being the original game had 3 separate DLCs, and as of right now, the second game only has 1 DLC. However, I'm not even sure if How Long to Beat considers those DLCs for this game, since as you can see, they might be listed under their own game. Regardless, we know that on average, the second game has less side content but more main content, but something I also noticed, and maybe this is just my opinion, but the side content in the original game was also of much better quality. It was just a lot more unique and memorable to me, especially seeing the penitent one interact with Miriam, which is the protagonist from another Metroidvania game, Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. And as I already touched on in the last segment, the NPC side characters in the original game were just more dynamic and nuanced characters in comparison to the ones in the second game, and they also just had more memorable gameplay. In Blasphemous 2, really the only side content I remember is just buying or retrieving items from people, which isn't bad, it just felt like there was a better variety in the original. And also, I loved all of the DLC content from the original Blasphemous, but the DLC for Blasphemous 2 could have been better in my personal opinion. Also, I should probably give you my opinion on the map design in both of these games. I do not remember having any issues with either of these games as map designs. I like them both equally, and do not really prefer one game's world over the others. And the final thing I will add is that not only is the original game cheaper, but all of the DLC content is built in nowadays, making it an absolute no-brainer. And also, conveniently as I was editing this video, the Blasphemous games are now both on sale, and the original game is $2.49 here in the United States. Now that is an absolute steal for one of my favorite games out there. So for all of those reasons, I think I have a decent case for giving this comparison to the first Blasphemous, and with that, the final score is 4-3 in favor of Blasphemous 2. Blasphemous 2 may have won in my comparison of these games, but trust me when I say it's really close. In reality, this comparison could have gone either way, and if you view some of the things I said in this video differently, more power to you. Some of my opinions could definitely be wrong, but I wanted to make this video solely out of passion for both of these games. These games are both masterpieces that have helped to shape my tastes for both art and music. They are both incredibly close in terms of their quality, and I know most people tend to prefer the first game, but if you ask me, I'd say the second game stands just as tall as the original did and maybe a few inches higher. But of course, let me know what you think about the games in the comments. Again, the Blasphemous games are games that can leave a lot up to interpretation, so be sure to enlighten me on different perspectives of these beautiful games. That's it for me, and I'll talk to you again soon.